Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. This is Victor Murphy. I'm with the National Weather Service Southern Region Headquarters in Fort Worth, Texas, and thank you for joining I believe this is our third Southern Plains Drought webinar series. Our main presenter today is going to be Dr. Dave DuBois of the Mexico State University and the State Climatologist for New Mexico. And we'll have time for Q&A afterwards. We'll go about 30 minutes or so on the presentation, on Dave's presentation, which should leave us about 30 minutes or so for questions and answers. You're welcome to type any questions you may have in the chat box, or else you can just, ask them, orally over the phone towards the end. I will unmute everyone at the end. So, without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and hand it off to Elizabeth Waite of the National Integrated Drought Information System. Elizabeth has been the heart and soul of these presentations and the main mover and shaker in getting them going. So Elizabeth, go ahead, the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much. Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining the webinar. We are going to be focusing on the drought in the Southern Plains, including portions of Kansas, Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, and Oklahoma. If you could advance to the next slide, please, Dave. So just going very briefly over the logistics, a 30 to 40 minute webinar, and some Q&A time after that. As was just said, there will be a recording of this webinar put on drought.gov. In addition, we will have a 2-page summary of the webinar that we'll put on drought.gov that you can share with colleagues and others. And then if you want the slides from this webinar, please reach out to me. My email address is right there, elizabeth.waite@noaa.gov. I'm happy to send the slides to you, the PowerPoint presentation, after the webinar. And we will have another webinar on June 27. So please join us for that webinar to continue to update you on the drought in the Southern Plains. And next slide, please. So I wanted to recognize that this has been a very collaborative effort with the National Weather Service, National Drought Mitigation Center, NOAA, and in particular, a tremendous amount of expertise and input from state climatologists from Texas and Kansas, Oklahoma, Colorado, New Mexico, the NOAA's Regional Climate Services Director for the Central Region, USDA Southern Plains Climate Hub Director, and National Weather Service. As I said, we couldn't put this together without a huge amount of input and collaboration among all of us. So I really want to recognize and thank everyone for helping to organize this. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Dave DuBois. Thanks, Dave. Take it away.
You bet. Thanks for that introduction. Let me go to the next slide here. All right. So if you don't know me, my name is Dave DuBois. I'm the state climatologist for New Mexico. And my office is down in Las Cruces, New Mexico. A bit of a drive from the Southern Great Plains, but our area in New Mexico covers that on the east side of this, like from Rio Grande Valley on eastward is probably considered in the Southern Great Plains in some parts. We also in our office, we manage COCORAs, and I'll mention a few things from the COCORAs. And if you don't know what COCORAs, it's not a cereal, but it's actually Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. So we'll talk about that later. And I also direct the New Mexico Climate Center, where we do a lot of things, including a lot of climate monitoring, and we call that the ZMET. That's our agricultural weather network. And we also manage the former U.S. Regional Climate Reference Network across New Mexico. And we also do a lot of work in drought. So that brings me here to this webinar. And we partner a lot with the National Weather Service, with Royce Fontenot over in the Albuquerque office. I hope he's listening. So let's get into the nuts and bolts of this webinar. If you go over to the right side of this slide, we're going to talk about where we are, the meteorological conditions, indicators, because drought is not just precipitation, it's a bunch of things, and we'll talk about all those things, and then we'll go into, we'll actually go into the impacts first. There's just a few of them. We talked some about these in the last webinar. Which week we'll do a follow-up. We'll talk about water, animals, livestock, and also agriculture. So agriculture will be one of the major focuses of this webinar. And then the end, actually, we'll look onto the outlook. So you have to stay to the end of this webinar to hear the outlook. So that's intentional. So let me go to the next slide. So where have we been? We've had, this is the precipitation over the last 24 hours based off of radar. And this is the May 21st, this morning's one-day observed precipitation. So you see there's, we had a few storms come through. We've had the some convective storms over in the Panhandle and move into New Mexico. Not a lot of fell in the majority of our area here. We got some precipitation over on the east side of Kansas and Oklahoma, but not a lot. And if you look over to the longer period, so I'm going to start going from the shorter into the longer periods to see how our drought has morphed and evolved. So this is the precipitation from PRISM. It involves lots of different data sources over the last 3 weeks. So this is from accumulated precipitation from May 1st through the 20th. So as you can see, if you look on I can put my mouse here. As you can see toward the red colors here, there's not much precipitation, less than 1/10 of an inch. Over most of New Mexico, and as you can get further east, you can see it's spotty. There are a few areas where they have only had about an inch or so, and then if you go further east into central Oklahoma and southeast Kansas, you can go into the 4 or 5 inches. So there are a few areas that had some precipitation fall over the last 3 weeks, but over the majority of the area here, it's been pretty light. If we go over to the water year, which just a reminder, water year starts in October. So this goes from October 2017 to the present. And this is percent average of precipitation over the water year. As you can see, this is when we start to see the longer term impacts of drought on just looking at precipitation. So if you look at the legend here down here on this part of the graph, you can see the majority of our area in western Oklahoma Panhandle is down in areas where they didn't get much at all, less than 10%, and over here in west central Oklahoma and down in the 20-30%, and areas in the Permian Basin down in the southeast New Mexico have yet to see precipitation really over the water year, and it's been really spotty. A few other areas, maybe just 1 or 2 events actually have impacted over here in the east central New Mexico. And so you can see kind of the impacts of drought just from looking at the percent of average. And sometimes it doesn't always tell you if you look at percent of average. So we like to use this other index called the Standardized Precipitation Index, the SPI. And it's basically what it tries to do, it puts it into normalizes them into so because some areas get more rain in the spring than others, and so it kind of puts it into kind of in the seasonality. It kind of puts them into perspective. And then when we rank them from 0 to -3, or if it goes if it's negative SPI, it's been much drier than the median. If it's a positive, it's wetter. So you can see over on the left side of the graph, we got the year-to-date SPI. You can see the SPI going down to in some areas in New Mexico less than 2. Most areas in Kansas in this 0 to 1 to -5, and also similarly with western Oklahoma, northern Oklahoma, and much of the Panhandle of Texas. Not until you get into the southeastern Oklahoma do you get positive SPIs. And if you go into the water year a little farther back, a few more months going from October, you can see the more impacts of what we had here in the west side of the Great Plains, where we had snow drought up in the mountains. We can see SPI going below -2.5 up to -3 in a few little locations bordering Colorado. So we go to the next slide here. So remember, drought is not only precipitation, it includes temperatures. So this is just an example of the above average temperatures over the last couple of weeks. This shows the departure from normal temperatures for the last 2 weeks over the continental U.S. And you can see how the impacts of the warmth is impacting all of the southern Great Plains above average, in some places more than 8 to 10 degrees or more above average over the last couple weeks. And so remember, this is important because we will also be looking at another index that looks at evapotranspiration. And that's this graph here. So this is a fairly new product called the EDDI, EDDI, which is the Evaporative Demand Drought Index. And it's based off of the evapotranspiration because that includes temperature, solar radiation, relative humidity, wind speeds, and all that is input into a calculation to measure the amount of stress on plants and our natural systems out there, and it basically puts them into like its same kind of calculation as the SPI. And this is over the last 60 days. So last 2 months, you can see the EDDI product is in the positive here. So that means the evaporative demand drought index, there's a lot more stress on our plant systems out here. And you can basically, you're seeing high impacts, 1.5 to 2 over the last 60 days over in the large parts of the southern Great Plains. Not until you get into the more eastern side of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas that you see less impacts on evapotranspiration. So most all of the Southwest has been in this pretty much stressed over with evapotranspiration, so that has a lot of impacts to growth of our plants and our rangeland, as well as our agricultural cropping systems. All right, and we go into the kind of putting a lot of this together. Here's our latest drought monitor map from May 15th. It came out last Thursday. Remember, our maps are published to the public on Thursday mornings, and as a community, we put this together. And as you can see, if you're not familiar with the drought monitor, here is the legends. So we have, it goes from D1 to D4, and starting from D1 to moderate drought. As you can see, most all of the areas are in at least D1, with the exception of the far north, Kansas, into Nebraska, and the far the quarter north of north part of Colorado. We've introduced as you go further into the drought intensity, we've introduced exceptional drought in parts and most all the states here, Colorado, New Mexico, Texas, Oklahoma, and Kansas, and we've increased that over the last week, especially over in New Mexico, where we've been seeing a lot of impacts on drought. And let's zoom in a bit. Gives a little better than showing the whole country. As you can see, the blue lines are our river basins. You can see impacts, and there's a lot of precipitation has been very spotty over the southern Great Plains. You can see areas where there's some maybe small improvements, but overall there's been degradation over a lot of the areas, including over here. I guess we're going to cover that in a different webinar when we talk about the Four Corners, but that's another area of that's been degrading in drought intensity. And so let me move on to just one of the, remember, drought is not only precipitation and temperature, but it's also longer term impacts of where does our water come from. So in some parts on the west side of the southern Great Plains, we have the snowpack driven surface water systems, and one such is the Pecos River Basin in New Mexico. So this is on the headwaters of this are in the Pecos Mountains, just on the other side of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in north central New Mexico. And I show on this graph here it gives you a sense of the snowpack over the whole water year. So it shows you from October, each of these lines here are 1 month. So it goes from October, November, December, etc. And here's the current right here. And basically this blue line is the long-term average. And basically the units of this are snow water equivalent. So how much actual liquid water is in the snowpack, and on average the peak snow water equivalent for the Pecos Basin is around 14 inches of precipitation at the peak on about April 1st. The red line is last year, and here is this current year. Pretty dismal. This green line, this 2018, basically peaked out more than a month early, and there was basically very little to no runoff. And this is actually a picture of the Pecos River, a few miles from Interstate 40. And as you can see, this is sort of a USGS discharge graph showing the amount of water. Normally, this is what we would expect, or long-term average, 86 years of data from the Pecos River, starting February through the present, and this is what we actually got. So very, very, very little to nothing, and it's just a visual confirmation of that. So if you're moving east, we can look at the water situation in Texas. Here's from the Water for Texas website showing the water supply, and as a state, if you look on top, it's about 83.8% full. However, if you look at, it's not regionally the same. If you look at the eastern side of the state, it's very different from the southern Great Plains, and especially in the Texas Panhandle and through east central, kind of a transition zone here where it's been very dry to wet full reservoirs, and it also includes the reservoir over here in Rio Grande. The Elephant Butte is very, very low. So we also look at wells as not only surface water, but we also consider groundwater. And here's a representative well that we're looking at. So this is over in Texas Panhandle. Here's a map, Amarillo. So it's right on the border between Texas and Oklahoma, pretty close. And this is over in Wheeler County. And basically it shows, so I plotted out the well depth over time, sort of starting around 2007. As you can see, there's been some decline since 2010. Then we've got some recharge we had a record wet time in 2015, brought it way up. And then we've been seeing a continual decline. There's been some jumps here and there, but overall decline since 2015 over this well. And this is probably a fairly representative view of well depth in this whole area. So I just wanted to give some graphs here. I mean, we actually may want to focus on this on a future webinar, and this is actually from Amy Kremen with Olala Water. And I just wanted to kind of go over this a bit, just to show you the aquifer status. It shows you from USGS data the depletions from 1950 to the present, and then just the last couple of years of data from 2013 to 2015. It's just showing, if you can get close to the monitor and see the numbers here from the prior to 2015, you can see the decline in a lot of the water level, and a lot of places there have been 10 to 25 and more, and a few locations there's more than 150 feet of change. It's been you have to go down further. And then if you look at the last 2013, 14, and 15, the three-year period, there's been changes in a few locations of more up to 10 to 20 feet in some locations. So here, right along the very northern part of the Texas Panhandle into Oklahoma, there's been some very big changes in the aquifer. And this other graph that Amy provided, I think I'm not going to go too much into this, but it kind of just shows you some of the the withdrawals. And one big question that came up was, are there any mechanisms to restrict agricultural water during drought? And it's really, as far as we know, and I think I got some input from Amy, that there wasn't really any mechanisms, and it's something happens primarily through the urban sectors and laws that go on. And we can go more into this later, but there's been, as you can see, there's quite a bit of drawdowns on these wells, and over, up when we do have drought, drought, and just kind of reading here, drought declarations, what we don't have in some of the areas, does not affect pumping limits allocations, but may affect junior water rights, where conjunctive water use ties, pumping to stream flow returns. And it's not to say that, this is kind of obvious, but irrigation can jump significantly in drought years, as seen in the 2011 to 2012. So that's something we really need to focus on during these years when we have significant more water use because of evapotranspiration. We need more water. So I'm going to not focus a lot of this because I think we may want to, I don't want to steal Amy's her talk maybe at a future time, but that's something we need to really be concerned about later on. So I just want to focus a little bit more on some impacts of, and I've been showing this picture here from New Mexico. I've been giving talks over different places, and I'm just showing, I usually give a talk and I ask, raise your hand if you have dry tanks, and pretty much every meeting I've had in New Mexico, majority of the people in the audience have said, my tanks look just like this. There's no water in it, or there's very little water. Some are nearly dry. Here's a picture I took while I was in Union County, and Gary McManus showed this picture of on the far side, east side of Oklahoma. There was actually some impacts there, but there's some of the water is actually too brackish for cattle, and even though they've had some precipitation, so that's another issue there too. So having with livestock. So what about the vegetation out there? So this is a satellite-based product. It's the Vegetation Drought Response Index, the VegDry, and we use this quite a bit just to see, kind of compare, what levels from space do we see the vegetation. And as we can see, if you look at the legend over here on the right, you can see there's a swath of area over here in north central Texas into central Oklahoma, west central Oklahoma into Kansas, where we see impacts from the vegetation responding to drought. That's a big concern with croplands and also rangelands. So we can see the impacts of the drought from space fairly clearly with this map, and also just a lead in for if you want to listen to the Four Corners impacts at a different webinar, that there's some very strong impacts from vegetation in the Southwest. So I won't dwell on that, but you can see that from the graph. And some areas doing pretty well up in the northern plain, and this is sort of indicative of La Nina. We've been seeing this in other La Ninas in the past, where we've seen more wetter in the north and drier in the southern states and some warm areas. So, and I also like to look at not only from space, but get impacts from folks who live in the area. So I got, we do this as a drought community, say, what does it actually look like on the ground? And I got this from Becky Bollinger over at the Colorado Climate Center, over areas east of Pueblo in Colorado, just showing some of the impacts. And so it really does look bad. She sent these photos. And then if we look in New Mexico, I got some impacts from eastern San Miguel County. That's on the sort of east central New Mexico. When I look at the vegetation from satellite, it doesn't look too bad, but then I've gotten some feedback from the ranchers, and it's not that good, even though it's they've gotten some precipitation back in the fall, but nothing much really since then. So what about other things? So I did mention COCORA's Community Collaborative Rain, Hail, and Snow Network. As a network, we also monitor conditions. So this is the condition report, and these are all the observers who are part of COCORA's submitting their condition reports, and we actually have them ranked, and these are based off of people's backyards and ranchers. So a lot of and on the background is the latest drought monitor. And in Colorado, New Mexico, we've been polling, asking our observers to input to the condition monitoring program, and they've been very nice in giving us some ground truth and getting some information. So if you are a member or you'd like to be a member, this is one way to contribute to the drought tracking for us. It's not a indicator, but it helps us to get some ground truth from people like you who are living in various parts of the Southern Great Plains. There are a few in Kansas, so it's just kind of a plug to get more impacts from folks across the Southern Great Plains. So I just want to talk just a couple slides on. I know we mentioned that in previous webinar on fire, because one of the impacts of drought is having very dry fuel levels, low relative humidities, high temperatures, high winds, and just kind of this is our as far as I can find is the latest significant wildland fire potential outlook for June, and seeing the above normal fire potential over large areas of New Mexico and Colorado, including Southwest. And not to say that we're not out of it for all of the area, but this in terms of above normal wildland fire potential. And just wanted to highlight one of the fires that we've been looking at as a community. So this is the Mallard fire. If you're over in Texas in the Panhandle, southeast of Amarillo, fairly large, 75,000 acres. Burned over the hilly areas, and it's just showing you from satellite. You can see from space, and it's actually we call it a pyrocumulus cloud developing. So that this is actually the fire from satellite, and then actually it's creating its own weather pattern, and you can actually see the lightning from that. So I thought this was pretty neat. I thought I would share that with you. But it's sort of we're not out of the danger in all of the areas here, including this area. So I just wanted to mention also we work a lot with the Farm Service Agency, and these are all the 2018 secretarial drought designations, and they do it by county. So these are the 4 states that we're covering here. So our primary counties in Colorado, 24. In Colorado, 30, New Mexico, 62 in Oklahoma, and 87 in Texas, and also includes the contiguous counties. So this is all the areas that were currently being impacted by drought, the drought designations across the country. I just wanted to briefly bring this up to show you, remind you. So I just want to transition into the agriculture impacts. I got some information from Brad Rippey on the winter wheat conditions. This follow up from previous webinar, and so this is for Texas, the state of Texas, the winter wheat condition index, and basically these are all the years going all the way back to 1995 to 2018, and just to show the progress of the winter wheat condition index. And remember, the condition index goes from very poor to excellent, and so we're started off on the bottom, sort of toward the bottom of the index. There have been a few years worse, but majority of the years in that last few decades are actually been much better in Texas. If you go to Kansas, we're one of the lowest over time. So just going back to Texas, so the abandonment rate in Texas compared to last year rose from 50 to 66% of the winter wheat planted, and from 2.35 to 3.1 million acres of abandonment for winter wheat. So if you go to Oklahoma, similar and very bad in terms of the condition index. We're down here in this red. Just been only 3 years that have been worse than 2018. And if we look at the Oklahoma winter wheat abandonment, and this is percent, and this is going from 1995 over here on the left to 2018. So if we compare it to last year, the winter wheat abandonment rose from 36 to 53% of the planted average, which corresponds to about 1.6 to 2.3 million acres. So that's the increase of winter abandonment. So it's 53% is an all-time record for Oklahoma. So that's very, very significant. So and it's just a graph a map to show you that over the whole country, the U.S. winter wheat, the change in yield in units of bushels per acre, and this is comparing last week to this I mean, last year to this year. So this year's numbers are preliminary based on the USDA NASS crop production report. So far, the numbers coming in are, not very good, which kind of jives what we've been talking about with the rest of the impacts. So, not good numbers. I just want to mention a few other drought impacts. For instance, there's been a few municipal water restrictions, like for instance, Hobbs, they starting to do a lot of water restrictions through September 15th. Gary McManus gave us some information on the see a lot of severe impacts to winter wheat, many acres being cut and baled for feed instead of harvested or zeroed out by insurance. Been seeing some reports in New Mexico and western Oklahoma, and you guys may have some updated information of ranchers selling cattle, culling cattle. And Gary also mentioned in Oklahoma, the wheat abandonment this year is estimated to be 53.5%, highest on record, like I mentioned. And also, just going back to the fires in Dewey County, reports from locals that little regrowth of vegetation in the Ray of Fire area. So the highs risen, of course, if you guys are familiar with this, risen into the mid-90s at times with high winds, 40, 50 miles an hour, leaving nothing but drifting sand across the burn scar. So it's not to belabor that, but so let's kind of move on to the now you've listened quite a bit into the webinar, and we're going to be talking about some of the outlooks. So here's our 5-day precipitation outlook from the QPF for this is valid from today through Saturday pretty much, and showing we're going to be looking at some much needed precipitation over the Permian area in West Texas and eastern side of New Mexico. Not a lot in majority of the southern Great Plains, other than this area over here, which was much needed. There's some areas of D4 in that area that really could use some precipitation. A lot of focus of precipitations over in the southern states along the Gulf, where the QPF is showing upwards of 3+ inches, probably more like 4 over the next 5 days. Okay, let's move on to a little longer time scale. Let's look at the 6 to 10 over here on the left side. So we're seeing this is a precipitation outlook. Next 6 to 10 days. Not real good, not real positive. We're seeing likelihood of probability of below average precipitation over much of the southern Great Plains. Into New Mexico, it's more of a normal. And if you go out next following week, 8 to 14 days, still the same pattern for the southern Great Plains and from Texas all the way up to the Dakotas, but seeing a bit of a transition of some moisture into New Mexico for the next 8 to 14 days, with this little area of above average, on the order of 40-50% probability of above average in that area. So that's good for where I am, but not good for probably most of folks on this call. So what about looking a little further out and outlook? So this is the NOAA Climate Prediction Center, CPC, temperature outlook for June through August. That's showing, and this is, remember, these are probability maps. These don't show temperatures at all, but just shows probability of, is it going to be a below, near normal, or above average? So this map is showing for June, July, August, most likely above average temperatures, and that's to be expected. We've been seeing this for months, but what about temperatures? So that's what a lot of folks have been looking at. Let me go to that one. So here's our precipitation outlook from the Climate Prediction Center for June through August. Most of the southern Great Plains is in this equal chance here for above average or normal or below. So, and not until you get into the Four Corners, into western Colorado, do you see some significance in the probabilities, more than 40% in here. But most of the area for this webinar are in this equal chances. So, which is actually good. We've been seeing a lot of below average, so that's sort of a good sign when we don't see this B with brown over it. So that's my good message. that I've been telling folks. If we get equal chances, that means we can get, there's a probability of getting near normal precipitation, which would really be helpful. And I think that's good. And that sort of drives this map. This is the seasonal drought outlook. So most of the Southwest is still in this chocolate-colored drought persists area. And not until you get into the Southern Great Plains do you actually see this lighter brown, which is drought remains but improves. And that's likely driven by the fact that we will be, likely seeing from the Climate Prediction Center some near normal equal chances, which is a good sign, whereas a lot of the area to the west is maybe seeing some, waiting to see until we get the monsoon to get any improvement over this area. But remember, this map goes from May through August, so it may be wait until later in the monsoon to see any improvement. We'll see. We'll see what this map gets updated. But there's some signs of some good news, and not real good news, but better than seeing something getting worse. So that leads us to this other graph. I think this is one of those graphs that it's another probability graph, and it shows you because a lot of our weather systems in this area are driven by the El Nino Southern Oscillation, and we've been significantly impacted by the La Nina phase of the El Nino Southern Oscillation. The La Ninas are typically for much of our areas, and not all the areas equally impacted, but it's mainly in warmer and drier for some areas. And so we're seeing likely chances of the La Nina, which is the blue bar, very small. We've finally transitioned into the neutral phase, and so that's what the gray bars are. And these are 3 months. April, May, June, July, August, etc. As you can see, the probabilities, we're currently in this neutral phase of 80% plus 70s. And as we go further in the year, about equal probabilities with neutral and El Nino, which basically the La Ninas have been cooler than average sea surface temperatures on the equatorial Pacific, and they've been slowly warming up a bit. And we'll be tracking that. It's a little too early to say whether we're going to get an El Nino or not for this coming winter, but at least the positive thing, the bottom line is that this blue has been very small, the probabilities for a La Nina. So I think that's a positive thing for a lot of our areas here. and we'll take a neutral or an El Nino for sure. Okay. So that's a good thing, and this is it's updates twice a month. I usually prefer the early graph because it has a mixture of models, and it's been actually looked at by forecasters. And then there's one that's been coming out mid-May that is mainly just models, but I kind of prefer the early May for my discussions. But you're also welcome to see the online mid-May. So I just wanted to, I hope you got a sense of what, from my perspective over here on the west side of the Southern Great Plains, what's going on. I'll stop with a nice picture of Union County. I was driving out there, so we can take some questions, and hopefully everybody's still awake. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, David. I would ask anyone if you have any questions at all, just either click on the question mark there on the on your control bar there. You click on the question mark, or else you can raise your hand, and I will go ahead and unmute you, and you can go ahead and ask your question. While people are thinking of questions to ask, I do want to point out it has been a little bit unusually wet in parts of the Texas Panhandle, at least the eastern part of the Panhandle, and southwestern Oklahoma over the past week or so. Pretty amazing. Childress, Texas, which is right there, sort of at the bottom of the Texas Panhandle where it meets, the Oklahoma, southwest Oklahoma. They've had measurable rainfall now for 8 consecutive days, which ties our all-time record for a number of consecutive days with measurable rainfall. So there has been some localized relief, I think, already. I don't want to say it's widespread, but there has been some localized relief already in parts of the area. Mainly there in the southeast part of the Texas Panhandle. on the upper Red River area in there. So, does anyone have any questions whatsoever that you want to ask? Like I said, you can either type them in the question bar there, or hit the hit the question mark icon or the raise your hand icon.
This is Elizabeth Waite. While we're waiting for questions, I just wanted to first thank Dr. Dave DuBois for his excellent presentation and great information. Thank you very much. And I also wanted to let everybody know, Dave mentioned the Southwest webinar on the drought, the Four Corners drought. That will be held on the 23rd of May from 1 to 2 p.m. Mountain Time. So please join us if you'd like to hear more about the drought conditions and outlook, and also a special focus on wildfire in the Southwest on the 23rd of May from 1 to 2 p.m. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. I'm going to go ahead and make myself the presenter here, and hopefully you can see that this image here is the 7-day observed rainfall over the past 7 days, ending at 7 o'clock this morning Central Time. And you can see a lot of 2 inches. The yellow areas here are 2 inches plus rainfall. You can see a lot of areas here with 2 inches plus of rainfall in southwest Oklahoma, parts of northwest Texas, and southern panhandle. The Childress area, which I referred to, is right in this area here. They've had basically 3 to 4 inches of rainfall. In parts of Texas, Ford County, Hardeman County have been in D4, D3, D4 for a long period of time. Parts of those counties got, you can see 5 inches plus. So there has been some relief, but it's been pretty localized here as you get into the northwest part of the Texas Panhandle. Not that much improvement. And unfortunately, of course, most of New Mexico has still been very dry, etc. But parts of southwest Kansas, western Oklahoma have seen some improvement. So I'm not seeing any questions at all. Any of the other panelists, Dave Brown, Doug Cluck, Brian Fuchs, Professor Nielsen Gammons, does anyone else want to add anything? If so, go ahead. You're unmuted.
Yeah, Victor, I guess if anybody has any opinions on upcoming potential impacts if it doesn't wet up much anymore. I mean, I guess wheat is pretty much done. So I don't know what the next layer of crops or pasture range forage implications are, maybe water supply issues. I know that we addressed it on our sort of internal call, but it'd be good to at least mention that a little bit more, and I don't know who wants to do that. Victor.
Yeah. You have a question here, Doug, from Chuck Hannigan. Basically, how do we register for the Southwest Drought webinar, which will be Wednesday? And you can do that by going to drought.gov and basically just click on the calendar. And you can
maybe you could just put that in the chat session.
Yeah, if you click on the calendar here on the drought.gov, you can see it here, Southwest Drought webinar. Click on that, and you can just register there for the Southwest Drought webinar, which will be on Wednesday from 1 to 2 o'clock Mountain Time, 2 to 3 Central Time. I think we'll have more of an emphasis there on fire weather, forest fires, especially our presenter is going to be Ed Delgado, who's with the National Wildfire Coordination Group out of Boise, Idaho. So thanks for the question there, Chuck. Any other questions at all?
Victor, did you want to say anything about water supply and how that is not an issue in some places or this year?
Well, I think Dave touched upon that. The reservoirs are doing pretty well because there was a very, as Dave did show, the Texas reservoir supply level. Dave, I'm going to bring the presentation back to you so you can perhaps show that slide.
Here's the.
So let me get it back to you.
Yeah, so here's the graph. Can you guys see that?
Yeah.
Yeah, so here's the map I showed from the water data for Texas. So majority of Texas is doing well in terms of reservoirs. It's just this area it's been a long-term impact, kind of right along. If you follow along the Texas Panhandle line that goes south, that whole area is still struggling. Those, like you said, Victor, those precipitation has been spotty, for water. So it's going to take a little bit more to help out with those areas. But yeah, things are not bad in the. I don't have data on the Oklahoma on their reservoirs. I just don't have that website. But this is for Texas.
Yeah, David, I
John
think
Nielsen, I'm a Texas State Climatologist. Just want to comment that many of those reservoirs are rarely, if ever, full. So it's difficult to assess drought conditions just from looking at the percent. Normally, you also have to compare with what's normally present this time of year. So, for example, the northernmost reservoir is nearly empty, so that's a big issue. The one south of that, Lake Meredith, actually is still benefiting from the rains it received over the past 2 or 3 years. So it's actually above where it normally would be this time of year, based on the past few years of weather.
Excellent. Thanks, John. And very similar with Elephant Butte. We've very rarely had. It's been since 1999 has been when we had significant water in that reservoir. So it's a long term.
Okay, I do have some questions here. I'm going to unmute the folks. I'll give you a heads up, let you know you're being unmuted. So Carrie Veselka, you're being unmuted. I think you have a question about the culling herds. Okay, I'll maybe get back to you. So Carrie's question was, aside from culling herds, are there any other options for producers trying to fight the drought? And any suggestions for producers with tight pastures due to drought? So anyone on the ag side want to answer those questions?
Like hauling water, haying, all that stuff.
Yeah, I guess other than culling herds, and hoping for rainfall, like you said, hauling water, hauling hay would be the not the only options I could think of.
Well, the other option is to move your cattle, and they'll move them to greener pastures, so to speak.
Right, we went through that in Texas back in 2011. I think it was the cattle on wheels exercise, as it was called. I see where Brian's got a question. Brian Grimet. Brian, I'm going to unmute you. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I was just wondering if anybody could give some historic perspective on this year's drought compared to droughts in the past. You kind of talked about a little bit with those graphs of the quality of the wheat, but I was just wondering, kind of in total, if there's any historical perspective that can be given.
Well, I can do the Mexico side of it. We can kind of go through each state, but and a lot of folks I've been talking to, in terms of impacts, it's very similar to 2011-12 for all the way from Union County going all the way down to Eddy County. It's a little different on the Four Corners. Their other analog is an earlier drought, but over in New Mexico, it's similar to 2011, the last La Nina. It's still early to see on the year to see more impacts. Especially if we get if the monsoon forecast doesn't really pan out. But I don't know. What do you think, for John, or I don't know who's in Oklahoma?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to find a good analog. 2011 is probably the closest up to this point. But the thing that was exceptional about 2011 was the fact that the drought persisted through the climatologically wettest time of year, June, July, and August. And of course, it still remains to be seen whether that will happen this time. We're off to a good start with the rain we've had the past week and rain forecasted the next week. But I would say the best analog is 2011 to date.
And
this is Gary McManus from Oklahoma, State Climatologist. Similar analog across far western Oklahoma and the Panhandle to 2011. And of course, as John said, we don't know how we're going to fare as we go through the next 3 months, where Texas and Oklahoma in 2011 had the hottest summer in the history of the United States. That, of course, exacerbated the drought conditions. But if you look at parts of western Oklahoma and the Panhandle, some of those stations have had less than 2 inches of rain since October 1st, 2017. So nearly 8 months worth of insignificant amounts of rainfall. And of course, that would very much be on the record side of the dryness scale. So as far as the historical aspect of this, some of those stations are pegging the driest last 7 to 8 months on record for those particular locations.
I was just going to mention the drought monitor, and maybe Brian Fuchs would want to say a couple words about that in terms of how often a D4 is supposed to appear in a particular area based on return frequency. Brian, do you want to address that?
Yeah. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. So with D3 and D4, the two most extreme levels that we show on the U.S. Drought Monitor, in an ideal world, if you had 100 years worth of data, D3, your current data would be compared to the driest 3 to 5 occurrences ever at that location. And so if you have 100 years of data, that would be the top 3 or 5 events. We know a lot of the indicators have various periods of record, so we rank them and break it into these similar percentiles. For D4, those are the really rare events, only going to happen 1 or 2 times in 100 years worth of data. And when we start looking at those return intervals, yes, we've had in the last decade, you can go into the Southern Plains and say, we've had more D3 and D4 than we're supposed to be seeing. But then again, the period has been very droughty for a non-scientific term. And we have had some significant drought events that when you start looking at the historical records that go back into Texas, especially in the 50s and the Dust Bowl era of the 30s and the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles and into Kansas and parts of Colorado, some of these most recent events have been right up there, statistically speaking, with some of those same events. So even though we have had quite a number of occurrences of D3 and D4 in the region here, it does show that these are in some instances approaching or are the drought of records for some of these areas.
Thank you, Brian. Got a few more questions here. This is from Dr. Holman, and I'll take a quick stab at it, and then I'll perhaps share with you, Dave, and or Professor NG. Dr. Holman's question is, can you speak more to the rest of the year and the winter outlook for precipitation? When should things turn around? And then heavy rain or snow this winter, question mark. As far as when should things turn around, I think climatologically, much of this area, the peak rainfall season is the summer months when the summer monsoon kicks in, which is usually around July 1st or so. So I think at least the western portion of the area, New Mexico, Colorado, should see some good improvement starting July 1 or so. As I showed earlier, I think portions of Texas Panhandle, western Oklahoma are already seeing the improvement. The wet season there pretty much starts right now and runs through June into July and does sort of continue through the summertime to a lesser extent. So I think short term things are looking pretty good. And as Dave shows here, this is a precip outlook for June through August. And if you get normal precip in June through August in this area, you should see some improvement. And then, of course, that area in the Four Corners there with above normal precip, that would be very welcome. And as far as the winter outlook goes, heavy rain or snow for this winter, question mark. A lot more difficult question to answer, but I think that perhaps a better way to answer might be what we don't expect to happen. As David shows here this graph, the odds of El Nino probabilities compared to La Nina are about 4 to 1 or 5 to 1 greater. So if there's any kind of a tilt for the winter season coming up, or the upcoming cold season, it will probably be for El Nino over La Nina. And of course, that would tend to portray at least near normal precip for the area. So hopefully this will be a short-term blip, and both short-term due to the monsoon kicking in, and then longer term with the El Nino expected, or at least a greater probability for El Nino over La Nina kicking in, that would hopefully mitigate things for next year, for next cold season. Dave or John, anything that you want to add?
Yeah, just this Dave DuBois, and I just want to agree with that. And so we, as further you go west, the more of influence you get from our monsoon, change of wind patterns to bring in moisture, and we in some areas we can get up to 40% of our annual rainfall during our monsoon, starting from like July through September, and so there's definite we're looking at this kind of probability is a good thing when we see EC. I think that's one of the things I've been sharing is at least there's no below average. If we can see EC, that's good. We would like to see above average to make up for some of those precipitation losses that we've had over the past few years. I know there's a few areas that have they've been missing more than 3 or 4 inches this calendar year from lack of precipitation. So yeah, it's more of it. I've been telling folks it's a little too early to say, because even if we did get an El Nino, they're not all the same. They're not always guaranteed to have an above average precip for El Ninos. Some of them, we've had a few that are at least average or even slightly below average. But like I said, it's too early to say. I think once we get into the out of spring, more into summer, we'll see how this shapes up. So I think it deserves a little more discussion. Every webinar we have is to look at how has it evolved, and then look at the drivers into the Pacific to see how things go. And there's other drivers as well that impact our weather patterns that I don't go into, but there's other factors that go in.
John, anything else that you might want to add?
No, I think you've all covered it.
Okay. I do have one other question here from Dr. Holman. I'm going to refer to our Central Great Plains experts, which I guess would be Doug and or Brian. The question is, when should drought improve for the Central Great Plains region? Which I'm going to take that to be Kansas and perhaps even up into Nebraska even perhaps.
Well, certainly Nebraska's seen quite a bit of rain over the last few days. I would not be surprised to see some of the trimming back across there and parts of eastern Kansas. I guess parts of eastern Kansas. Knowing when drought is going to get better is a $1 trillion question. So based upon there's the QP. There's the next 5 days, I think. Is that as of today? Yeah.
Yeah.
5-day forecast for precipitation. So, this is the wettest time of year. We're sort of in the middle of it over the next 30 days for this part of the country. So, if it doesn't happen in the next 30 days, we're going to be in trouble, or conditions could get worse. So, it's a key time. Central Plains, Southern Plains, Northern Plains, for that matter.
Just to add on to what Doug said, this is Brian. One thing I've been really keeping an eye on has been the temperatures, and for mid to late May, we're already pushing some temperatures that are probably about a month ahead of where we typically would see them. So two key things. If we don't see the precipitation in the central plains and into the northern plains the way we should climatologically, along with the warmer than normal temperatures that are popping up through this region already, it's going to be one of those instances that temperatures and evaporative demand, what kind of demand we're going to start seeing from the agricultural sector, how soon irrigation kicks in. Those are all going to be keys probably that we're going to see in the next 4 to 6 weeks developing, and that's probably going to tell the story for most of the rest of the summer at that point.
Okay, I don't see any more questions here. Obviously, if you have any questions that weren't answered, you didn't get a chance to ask them, you can just send it to me at Victor, VICTOR, .Murphy, MURPHY at NOAA.gov. I think it should be on your email. Or there you go right there, Dave DuBois. And Elizabeth, I'll kick it back to you. The recorded version of the webinar will be available from the drought.gov website. And our next webinar will be June 27th. And Elizabeth, anything that you want to add before we sign off?
Just want to say thanks again, Victor, and thanks, Dave. I really appreciate it. And thanks for everyone for joining us. Again, the 23rd of May from 1 to 2 for the Southwest Drought webinar. And as Victor just said, June 27th for the next update on the Southern Plains. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone. And thank you, Dave, for being our presenter.
You're welcome. See you all.